It's time to deconstruct episode 84. Episode 84 was Meet Jessica Robinson, committed to the future of mobility. And as I thought about that episode, I thought, who would be the best person to get on the microphone with me and deconstruct Jessica Robinson? It's quite a task, you know. And then I thought of the perfect person. Certainly somebody who is no stranger to the mic and has actually sat the other side of the mic to me previously, and that is Katelyn Davis. And when I recorded Katelyn a couple of years ago now, her episode was titled Meet Katelyn Davis, Ambassador for Millennials and Mobility, which is a title that I bestowed upon her, and she has loved, she has lived up to every little bit of that and much more. So Katelyn, welcome back to the mic.
Thank you for having me. And I've also loved that title, by the way. So thank you for that.
It suits you. It's perfect. It is. It's who you are. And one of the things that I often talk about when I talk about you, which I do talk about you from time to time, is that you are Katelyn Davis. You know, when I grew up in automotive, right, my career, I would always identify with the company that I worked for or the job that I had. And I think a lot of people do that. But now that's changing. And you're one of the first people that I met that really has a personal brand. You are who you are. You have a value system. You have a belief system. And that doesn't change. It doesn't matter what company you work for. See, I was used to assimilating into whatever culture they wanted me to be. And I became that person, you know, unfortunately. But hey, I discovered authentic leadership now. And so here I am. So thank you, Katelyn, for being you and staying true to the course.
No problem. I'm glad I could be an inspiration. I mean, it was really kind of a byproduct of the time that I entered the workforce. One, we were like at the very early onset of probably the more personable social media that we know today. Influencers were on the rise, and not to say that I had like started my gist at being an influencer, but it was also the recession when I entered the workforce. And so I was always trying to figure out, like, how can I set myself apart? I once found out that a job I applied for had 150 applicants. And I was like, wow, it's an entry-level position. So like, we're all just coming out of college at the same time. And like, how do I make myself sound different or look different? Or, you know, how do I get a leg up? And I started building a professional persona for myself online, and it's been great. I've met a lot of great people, had a lot of great opportunities, and yeah, it's a different way to sort of look at how to present yourself.
It is. Well, you've been doing it really well. And to those listeners who would love to know more about you, go back and listen to episode 19, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But here you are today, and we're going to talk about Jessica Robinson, and we're going to talk about mobility. And one of the areas that we covered in Jessica's podcast interview was this idea of traditional automotive versus mobility. Katelyn, let's talk about mobility. Now, you've been working in the mobility space for several years, so tell us, what have you been doing? What have you been up to since the last time we talked?
Yeah, since the last time we talked, we've been through a lot. I've been through a pandemic, but a lot has changed with my career as well. So I went from working in PR and communications agencies where I serviced a lot of very traditional automotive companies, auto shows, sort of what we think of as the traditional industry, cars and such. I then moved into an agency that specialized in mid to late stage mobility startups. So I spent a lot of time with companies who were sort of reshaping the way we look at movement, whether that's on the road, it's in the air, it's in the sea, and looking at things like autonomy and electrification and all the little pieces that go into it. From there, I sort of jumped ship into working in-house, and now I'm representing a company called Katelyn, which is building roadways and road infrastructure for autonomous vehicles.
That sounds fascinating. The more I learn about Katelyn, I'm not going to pretend to understand what they're doing, but they're really setting the stage for the world of mobility. Is that a fair assumption?
It is. I think there's been a lot of money invested and a lot of time and resources invested into the in-vehicle technology. So the things that we need for the vehicle to be able to drive itself and to automate some of the components of the driving experience for drivers. But there hasn't really been a concerted effort to really think about the roads that these vehicles are going to be driving on. And for those of you who have spent a lot of time in this industry, know that with autonomous vehicles, there's going to be a lot of AI training around different instances on the roads and how to react to certain things, and environmental training. If we can sort of standardize the operating environment that these vehicles are going to be driving in and working in, then we should be able to make that leap to full autonomy much faster. So that's what Cavenue is trying to do. We have a 26-mile route that we're working on right now in Michigan. And from there, we hope to scale and do a nationwide network of these roadways.
So again, you remain at the forefront of mobility. That's not changing. So in the interview with Jessica, we explored this idea, the definition between automotive and mobility. And certainly mobility is much more of an ecosystem to it, because it's not just about the car, like you say, it's about the whole infrastructure to support it. But one of the things that Jessica said, and it really struck me, is that people who think about traditional automotive, and she said, they might not find themselves at the center of the story anymore. And it might not be this sort of linear customer-supplier type relationship. So what are your thoughts around that?
I really enjoyed listening to Jessica talk about this, because I think she talked about it in a way that I hadn't really thought about it before. And she's absolutely right. I spent the first half of my career in more of the traditional automotive space before moving into new mobility. And that sequence of how business is done and how even staff works on projects and is brought into things has been the same for a very, very long time. The way companies bring product to market has been the same for a very, very long time. And so if you've been in that industry for a while, it doesn't matter what company you work at, if you're at an OEM or if you're at a supplier, you really understand how the ecosystem operates and what to expect. When you get into mobility, which is really born out of the automotive industry in part, but also a very big mixture of the technology industry with a lot of Silicon Valley vibes, it's a much different beast. It moves much faster. It's much more aggressive. Things change very, very quickly. And out of that, too, is kind of what Jessica was talking about, is you might not always be the star, or you may be a star in part of it, but not all of it. And so in the mobility space, there's a lot of startups. So you can see like this big funding ecosystem. And so someone might get a big fundraise and they might be this shining star in autonomy, while there's a shining star of electrification or aerial mobility or something like that in a different area. And then it could come down to pilots and deployments and who's doing certain things. And so it's very interesting. It changes really, really rapidly. New players coming in, old players going out. It's very different than anything that I've experienced in automotive, and probably a lot different than most people who have worked in sort of these historical industries that have existed for a really long time.
Yeah, I agree. And then if you take this idea of mobility being an ecosystem and many different players and interacting together, sometimes in a linear relationship, sometimes not, all these parts moving at speed. To me, I draw a parallel between that definition of the industry and leadership and culture within the industry. As I've said many times, we're great at the product side of this. We're great at saying, hey, look at my new EV lineup. And, I'm going from ICE to BEV and this is my product lineup, right? And that's great. But we don't focus so much on the people and the processes and the culture. And I think the same thing applies. If you can wrap your mind around the fact that automotive is no longer traditional automotive with this buyer-supplier kind of relationship, that it's more of an ecosystem and there's all these parts moving together at speed and you have to kind of figure it out, then if you can do that, you can be a leader for the future, because you can then apply that thinking to the culture and to the people. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's absolutely correct, because I think this change in industry dynamics also has a change in internal company operation dynamics. And so I've seen it a lot with the startups that I was working with before coming to Cavenue and then now at Cavenue, is that to be a quote unquote leader, you don't necessarily need to be the person with 35 years of experience who's managed 100 people over the course of their career. Like, that's not it. It's now about who has the ability to, lead people, inspire people. And sometimes it's even like who can even just like make the culture seem or be better, who's, cracking jokes here or there. And so it's really fun to sort of see how you can have different leaders come out of your organization and what it is that they sort of specialize in. Being that Cavenue is a small company, and I spend a great deal of my time doing thought leadership with people, getting them up on stages and speaking opportunities, and getting to find people who really haven't been in this position before. And they're like, I don't know if that's for me. I don't know if I want to do public speaking. And I'm like, here's why you're great. Here's the thing that you bring to the table that someone over, superior to you in the ladder of things may not be able to bring to the table. And so it's really kind of a different way to look at leadership and look at dynamics of teams.
You remind me of something, right? You're gonna cringe when I tell you this story, right? You ready? So you just said that you work with your teams and you encourage people to get on, speaking gigs and panels. And it's important. It's important for the development. It's important for the brand of the company, for their personal brand. We all know this, right? Many years ago, I was told directly, do not encourage people to get exposure to the outside world on panels and speaking gigs, because people will want to hire them away. I mean, how short-sighted could you possibly be? Yes. And I remember I had a speaking gig once. It was where it was in London, but I mean, that sounds like a big international speaking gig. It wasn't really. I was on a business trip and I was going to stop by this. It was Ariba at the time, which was like a purchasing software, right? I was going to stop by their conference and do this speaking gig, and it wasn't a huge deal, right? And my boss didn't like the idea, because he thought that it was too much exposure, and that other companies might want to hire me away. And I'm what? How short-sighted. But there again, Katelyn, there's an example of the culture changing, right? That's the way that we used to think in the past, and now it's different.
Absolutely. When I was working in the supplier world, which is very, very traditional, I was very limited to like my chief engineer, my department VPs or head of product, and it was a very small group of people, like maybe 5 or 6, and that was really it. To see that change over the last couple of years, to really like share the love, I think the mindset has really changed on, let's not hide them because we're afraid someone's going to hire them. Let's give them these professional development opportunities so that they know that we value their opinion, and we value it so much that we want other people to be able to learn from it. And I think there's always the possibility that someone could see someone at a conference and be like, I want that person, I'm going to hire them. But that could also happen on LinkedIn or anywhere else. And so it's more about the experiences that you can offer your staff, and uplift them and make them feel like you value their opinion.
And then guess what? They'll stay.
They do. They do.
So this, instead of living this life of fear that, oh my gosh, they're going to leave, how about you invest in the people, give them the exposure, challenge them, make them feel great about who they are so that they will stay and even progress to more challenging roles and more responsibility in the company.
And
How
Jan,
about
this
that?
isn't just external facing things as well. This is, running your company's all staff meeting, or doing an internal demo day, or just hosting the quarterly check-in or something, like giving people the opportunity to sort of grow into different roles, have their voices heard is incredibly important. And for everyone else at the company, it's also good because, let me tell you, they're tired of hearing from the same 5 people all the time, and they want to hear from someone else.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I like about Jessica's career. She's seen it all, right? Because she's from tech startups, from Zipcar, well, starting as a tea taster, but all the way through to working at Ford and now Assembly Ventures. She's been there and done that, and she has taken I call it the best bits of all of her experiences to put it together to be the leader that she is today. And she said, you mentioned the word mindset, and she said, when I asked her about what's the number one trait of the 21 traits of authentic leadership that resonate with her the most, and she said it was mindset.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think getting your mindset in the right way, being flexible to change. I'm seeing a lot of people coming out of the traditional industry into the startup, and it's not an easy move. It's not an easy change, a culture change, a way of work change. But if you have the right mindset, it becomes much more manageable, and that transition period is much faster, and you really get the hang of it much quicker.
Let's talk about fear. So Jessica talked about fear. We talked about it quite a bit. And she said it's not about pushing through the fear or avoiding the fear. It's about learning to sit with it and then choosing to go on and do the thing anyway. Mm-hmm. And that's the first time I have heard somebody say that, because most people talk about pushing through the fear. Mm-hmm. And she says, no, you've got to sit with it, right? You've got to just let it sit with you and take it on board and then move forward. And I thought that was really interesting.
I did as well. I think it's an incredible way to look at a very uncomfortable situation. And I think you're right. For the most part, we always thought, like, just push through, and as soon as we're past it, we'll feel better. But you don't really learn a lot about yourself in that moment of pushing through. And so I think Jessica hit the nail on the head. By sitting with it, you'll end up learning a lot about yourself, in which you can then use to, help your team, help others also identify those feelings of fear and work through them.
Yeah, because when you're sitting with it, you're right. It's a bit of a self-awareness exercise too, right? Because you're saying, okay, now why am I afraid to do this? What's going on here? What am I afraid of? What could possibly happen? And when you go through that mental process, that's incredibly powerful.
It's really activating that. What is the term? Fight or fight?
Fight or flight. The amygdala.
Yeah. I'll start over. Yeah, so that's really sort of starting that fight or flight response that your body has. And so if you can delay the flight or the running through it, you'll end up growing more as a person. The next time that comes around, you'll have less of a fearful reaction or less of a negative reaction. And it's a much more calming mindset. It seems so simple when you think about it, and I don't think until I had heard Jessica talk about it that I had really ever stopped and thought about it that way.
Yeah, of all the people I've interviewed, nobody had ever described fear that way, about sitting with it, and I agree. I think it's really powerful, really powerful.
I love it.
Yeah, and Katelyn, what I love about doing these episodes where we deconstruct an episode is that when you're interviewing, when you're doing a recording like this, I'm in it, right? I'm in the conversation. And then I listen to it, I listen to the recording and I think, oh, I should have gone deeper on that. Or, oh, that, okay. And I have a chance to sit with it, right? To sit with the actual conversation. And so it gives me a chance then to go deeper into some of these areas and then get a different perspective from somebody else.
Yeah, I do this practice of yoga that is part meditative, part deep stretching, and it primarily deals with the same thing, this fight or flight response. And so you get into a deep stretch and then you hold it for 2 to 3 minutes. And your body gets to the point, or the muscles get to a point where you start to feel discomfort, you can feel the stretching. And it's all about, slow breathing to sort of like ease and work your muscles through it. And by the time you're starting to get close to the 3-minute mark, that pain has subsided, the discomfort has subsided, and you can almost lean into the stretch further than you could 2 or 3 minutes ago. And when I heard Jessica say that, that's the first thing that I thought of. And I was like, well, of course that makes sense. I've been doing this practice for a very long time with my body, but I had never thought about how I could apply that same principle to something else.
I love that. Yeah, you're so right. Okay, let's talk about a quote that I think I'm going to take this as my mantra for 2023. That's how powerful this is, okay? And as you know, the work that I do with my clients, I'm often talking about command and control versus authentic leadership. But there's another side opposite to command and control. Is this culture where we're too nice to each other. And when we're too nice to each other, we don't like to say that we didn't like an idea or there's a better idea. We just want to play nice and then leave the room, right? And that, I think, can be more soul destroying than command and control, quite frankly. Because at least with command and control, you can typically get into a fight with somebody, right? But when people are too nice to each other, that can be awful. I've worked in a culture like that, and it really is. It's exhausting, believe it or not, because you want to shake people. You want to say, "Come on, talk to me, tell me, what do you really think?" Right?
Yes.
And she had this quote, and it came out of our discussion. We were talking about startups and startup companies engaging with tier ones and OEMs, and that whole mess. Mm-hmm. I'll call it a mess because nobody's figured it out yet. Well, and she came out, she said to me, she said, a fast no is better than death by 1,000 meetings. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, that is so true. That gets right to the heart of that. Right, and it's not, we came at it from a bit of a different context. We were talking about the startup companies doing business with tier ones and OEMs. Yeah, but I think it can be applied to a number of different things, and it's just my mantra now for 2023, right? Mm-hmm. I'd much rather have a fast no than have somebody delay the process because they didn't want to offend. That goes right to the heart of culture, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one really large difference, not to keep comparing traditional auto to mobility. But I think the time I spent in the supplier world and at the OEM world, much more used to hearing no, or that idea is not going to work for X, Y, and Z, and just very, very directness. I had a conversation recently with someone who also works at a mobility startup, and they were like, yeah, I think we're still in this honeymoon phase of startup where everyone is nice, but it's really not it's not useful at this point. When do we just start yelling at each other? And at first I was like, wait, you want to yell at each other? And then I was like, no, I mean, that is an accurate reflection of how good work gets done quickly, is because you can have these open and honest discussions with people. And if you all know this arena in which you're playing in, you know that you're doing it because we need to move things along faster. And that it is going to be death by 1,000 meetings if we just keep politely not telling you how we feel about something. So I think that's also like a very big cultural change between the two industries, and one that the mobility industry could probably learn from.
With your experience, Katelyn, what advice would you have for startups who are trying to engage with tier ones or OEMs? Because, as you know, with my background with supply chain, I just have this fear of 35-page, 50-page terms and conditions document being thrown at a startup, and then I could just see them running away screaming, as most normal people would if they were not used to, traditional terms and conditions that we have in the auto industry. What advice would you have for startups coming into this?
So I've worked with a lot of startups. I've probably worked with almost 24 across autonomy, electrification, ITS, battery technology, battery recycling, like the whole nine yards. And what I will say is that all of these companies are really great at talking about their company's value proposition as it applies to the consumer or whoever the end user is, in a very public manner. The truth to it is that, especially in mobility, most of this technology is not going to be acquired by you and I at Best Buy. We're not going to go out and buy a LiDAR sensor. So why are you spending so much time messaging to me? Also, it is very unlikely that that technology is even going to be picked up by the OEM market. In some cases, it will. But the grand majority of all of the mobility tech or any automotive tech is really coming through the supplier network. And so they're the ones that are able to move a little bit faster than the automakers. They're the ones whose timeline works a little bit better with startup world. And ultimately, they're the ones that are, selling and getting all of this stuff into the vehicles. And so if there's one thing that I would say kind of needs some work from these companies is who you're messaging to and what that message is. Now, if you are looking at the suppliers, which is my recommendation, you really have to figure out what is the return for them. Why is this a good thing for them to then go to bat for you with the automaker to include? I don't think that is happening really well. There are some that do it better than others, and obviously it's a very hard thing to sort of gauge from the outside. But in my experience, they're just not doing a really great job at understanding the needs of the supplier network and how to work with them.
What resonated with you the most from Jessica's episode?
I think what resonated with me most about everything that Jessica talked about was her pathway into this industry. And so I think so many people in this industry see career pathways as very linear, and have a hard time really understanding the vastness of this industry and what it really takes to understand the full gamut of it. And Jessica, I believe, is one of those people who really understands many, if not, I would like to say all, but she would be like, Katelyn, that's not true. But Jessica really understands all of the different pieces that go into the industry. And that's because her career has not been linear in this industry. It has been here and it's been there and over here. And some of it has been out of the industry, in education, in being a tea taster. Like, you learn something from all of that. And I think it's a good reminder for people, especially people who are doing hiring managers or people in HR, other people in leadership, that everyone's journey may look different. And sometimes it's this odd mix of things that kind of makes you scratch your head may actually be the better fit for your team.
I see you as you're an early adopter, for want of a better term, of understanding the value of a personal brand.
Mm-hmm.
As you look at Jessica And she has a tremendous amount of credibility and integrity. She's very well respected in the industry. What is it about her personal brand that gives her that from a personal leadership perspective? What is it?
Yeah, I think it has been that she has so many different areas of expertise and has become a subject matter in so many different areas. And she has always been sort of comfortable with being for like a front-facing person in the organizations that she's been at. And so people have always sort of gravitated towards her because they know they can trust her for her opinion, they can trust her for the information she knows. And that has really helped her a lot. I mean, I'm trying to think back as I say this. I think I've always known Jessica as a thought leader. I think she had always sort of been in this public eye since I've known her. And that was one of the things that I gravitated towards because I was still, young in my career, and to see another woman up and talking about all this great stuff who didn't really come from a technical background. And I was like, this is what I want. Like, I don't come from a technical background, but I want people to feel like what I have to say is important. And Jessica was really one of those first people for me that really validated that a career doing, different parts of the industry that is not on the technical side could really pay off in the long run.
Yeah, and she's very mission driven.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we started off this podcast talking about you, and you are Katelyn Davis. You have your value system, you have a mission. And it doesn't matter what company you work for, that's not going to change. And Jessica strikes me as somebody who's very much the same way, right? Mm-hmm. She believes deep in her heart and soul, her passion for moving mobility, moving the industry, right, in a big way, and she's committed to making that happen. Mm-hmm. And that may take different forms. It may be different companies along the way, but that belief system doesn't change. And that is authentic leadership in its finest sense.
Exactly. And now with Assembly Ventures, she has the ability to sort of work with different companies who fit the individual pieces of her value system, and really work with companies that speak to her, make her heart sing, get her really excited to go to work. And that's something I've always strived for. Like, I only want to represent technologies and platforms in which I feel are doing something good for the world or for people. And that's kind of what I've always lived by.
Yeah. And she said in another part of the interview too, she said, we have the power to choose what we want our companies to be. Because I think there's two parts to that. First of all, we have the power to choose who we want to be, right? And how we show up and what our brand is all about. But we also have the power to choose what we want our companies to be. And I think in the past, we've lost sight of that. We didn't think that we could do that. We've accepted the culture in automotive for decades. It is what it is. I hear that all the time. It is what it is, And we need to step back and say, hey, well, you know what? We do. We have the power to choose what we want our companies to be, to choose how much of, I'll call it, EV startup culture, California culture, how much of that we want in our culture. Traditional auto is not all bad. There's some really good things in that culture. So we really do have this power to choose our culture. Do you think that's right?
I do. And as you're saying that, thinking about your audience for this podcast, and a lot of them are in more of the traditional auto sense, and I'm sure they're like, but Jan, I can't change my company. It's been around 100 years. Like, I just can't do it. I think there's a lot to be said in how your team is what you build, and the environment that you have internally is what you build. I remember this was probably like 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I was at a supplier, and we had it was our supply chain and purchasing team, and they were crazy people. Like, they had spirit weeks, and they were doing all this like weird stuff. And at the time, because I had only ever known the very traditional working environment, I was like, this is weird. This is so strange. Like they're having so much fun at work and I don't get it. And I look back on that and being, that's not strange. That was just sort of my first exposure to what different workplaces could look like. And although our workplace was very like structured and authoritative and it was very layered in levels of leadership, they were trying to find a way to keep their teams engaged in a way that was more friendly and upbeat. And we see that a lot in the startup space. That's kind of what when Google first started talking about culture as a recruiting tool, that's what they wanted out in the world. And so I think there's a way to still transition some of this into the big organizations. Even if you don't have a lot of authority to make big changes, you can at least do it with your team.
Yeah, and that's so true. And honestly, I felt that in my last corporate job more than any other time was the time where I was facing my peers and my boss. I'm not going to say it was a different person. I mean, it wasn't a different person, but there was a different kind of behavior, right? Mm-hmm. I learned to fit the mold, as much as I hate to admit that, but I did. And when I was facing my team, that was a whole different thing, right? Because that's when I came alive and we were talking about our mission and what we were going to do, what we were going to accomplish, how we were going to do it, what the global organization was going to look like. It was a much more inspiring conversation. Mm-hmm. And I decided to introduce dancing at the beginning of my staff meetings. And as you can imagine, in a conservative tier 1, imagine walking by the hallway past my office and hearing AC/DC blasting at 9 o'clock in the morning.
I love that.
You know,
I love that.
But I did it because I just wanted people to have a different feeling. I want to change the energy level in the room. And why not? Why not? Just because we've never done that before in automotive? Start changing things up, people. Why do we feel that we've got to be so straight-laced and fit this mold? Otherwise, we're going to be judged and we're not going to be liked. Get over it.
Yeah, we did something similar when I was not dancing, but when I was at the tier 1, we on Fridays, we would have some sort of prize. Sometimes it was like a gift card, sometimes an actual like little prize. And we would play bingo throughout the day. And so there was the little ball basket with the turner, and you would pick a ball or whatever. And anytime someone went to the bathroom or walked past the desk where it was, they'd spin it, they'd pick a ball, and they would yell it out to the whole department. And people, in the morning, I would come in, I would leave a bingo card on everyone's desk. And so they would mark it off. And sometimes it would take us 4 or 5 hours to get someone to call bingo, because you might call a number now, the next one might be in 15 minutes. And it was like a really fun way to sort of end the week. And we would have, guests come through the department and they're like, what on earth are you all doing? I'm like, we're playing bingo. And it doesn't have to be disruptive to work. I mean, that's, 30 seconds out of your day, here or there, and it's not that big of a deal. But people loved it. People loved coming in for bingo day. And it's just something different that, you don't really see everywhere else, and gives people the opportunity to smile and laugh with each other. And, those are the things that I think you take for granted. But it wasn't always that way. It sometimes was, fitting into a mold. It was, being quiet, keeping your head down, and just doing the work and going home at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, to wrap this all up, Jessica's number one trait was mindset. And we can see mindset play out in her interview in so many different ways. This ability to sit with fear, this idea that we have the power to choose what we want our companies to be, this idea that you're no longer at the center of the story anymore, that mobility is an ecosystem. It's an all-encompassing ecosystem that's changing and moving at speed. It's not this linear relationship anymore. all of that comes together and then manifests itself in authentic leadership. What message, Katelyn, would you have to our audience to take this idea, the ideas that Jessica has in her interview, and authentic leadership forward to prepare for the future in automotive? What would be your closing comments?
Yeah, I think the biggest part of it is, something that sort of encompasses all of that, which is stop looking at things so linearly, and that by including more people as decision makers or thought leaders, and the open and honest transparency with your team, just because you're their supervisor doesn't mean you need to know everything, and being able to admit that you sometimes don't. Being able to really humanize yourself outside of some sort of hierarchy with your team goes a really long way. And ultimately, your end product is better, your team culture is better. All around, that ends up being better for everyone and for your company.
Absolutely right. Katelyn Davis, thank you so much for joining me on the mic today.
Yes, thank you for having me again.